What's up, folks? Welcome to Woodworking Against the Grain. We're actually in the woodworking shop today. I've got a 2 by 2 inch piece of solid pecan here, about 20 inches long, that we're going to turn into a rolling pin. Well, we've got this squared up, got the end squared off. What I'm going to do now is take it over to the table saw, cut part of these square ends off, then we're going to take it over to the lathe and turn it down round. Stay with us.
Alright, we're going to take this block of pecan here and run it through the table saw and cut off these sharp edges on the side, which is going to get this thing closer to being round. It takes a lot of the work out of turning it on the lathe. If you put about 8 sides on it instead of just 4, we'll just run it through here with our blade set at a 45-degree angle and our fence moved over to where it just trims off the sharp edge on all 4 sides of this pecan stock here. Once we get it kind of an octagon shape, then we'll take it over and chuck it up in the lathe and start working on getting it round. This just takes a little work off the lathe, a little bit of a time saver as we cut these sides off. Be careful doing this. I know it looks like my hands are getting pretty close to that saw blade, but that's the angle of the camera. They're really not that close at all. I tend to be pretty safe in the shop, so sometimes the camera angle makes it look like I'm a little bit closer to the blade than I am, but don't let that bother you. I'm always a pretty good distance away from where that thing's turning. Now we've got it chucked up on the lathe here. We're going to just start with our roughing gouge and work it down into a cylinder. Really the hardest part of this making a rolling pin is just getting the whole thing the same circumference all the way down the length of the stock. My tool rest is not long enough to work the whole piece at one time, so we'll have to take it 1/2 at a time. But you want to make sure when you set your tool rest up also that you set it up with the lathe turned off and you get it back away from the stock far enough to where when the stock turns it doesn't catch the tool rest at all. Leave about a 1/16 or an 1/8 gap between the tool rest and the stock that's turning. You don't want enough gap there that your chisel can get wedged down in there, but you want enough that it doesn't hit the stock as it turns around. You also want to have your tool rest about halfway up on the vertical axis of this stock. And obviously as you turn the stock and it gets smaller, you'll have to periodically stop and move your tool rest a little bit closer to your work. You don't want enough gap there that your roughing gouge can be caught between the stock and the tool rest. Now I'm just checking it for round here. I'm going to turn it back on, do a little bit more. Work this on down. You can see, if you look close, you can see the ridges that appear in this where it's been turned. In order to keep this perfect, you would have to keep a steady movement and an exact same amount of pressure pushed against that stock all the time, and I'm not good enough to do that yet, so I have to just keep going over it till we get it about where we want it and try to get those ridges to a minimum, and then what's left there we'll try to get out with the sanding process once we get it turned down. We're going to get this down to where it's about the right size and pretty close to being symmetrical. We'll move our tool rest down and do the same thing to the other end, and then once we get that other end turned, we'll start to work on our handles. Now this is going to be a French style rolling pin. We're going to put what they call a French taper on the ends of this for handles. They're not going to be handles that actually spin within the rolling pin. That's a little bit more advanced than I'm set up to do right now. We are going to try to make this look as good as we can. I've never worked with pecan before, and this right now seems to be quite a bit softer than walnut or maple that I've been using for these rolling pins so far. Now we've moved the tool rest down. We're going to turn this end down to match that other, and you want to be careful too when you're working all the way to your live centers, which are the metal pieces on the end of your lathe that have the stock held in place. You don't want to get your chisel down into that, because number one, it's got a spur on it that'll take that chisel away from you and it may throw it back at you. And also it's a very hard steel and it will nick your chisel, and it'll take you a long time to file or grind that nick out of there to get your edge back on that thing. Now we're just easing this down, and you can see the line around the circumference of the stock as we go back and forth across our tool rest here. Each of these passes just shaves off a very small amount of wood, but you have to make sure that if you have a certain minimum diameter that you're going to, that you don't go below that, because obviously you can't put this wood back on once you have really whittled it off of here. So when you get your diameter to where you want it in one spot, check it with your calipers, and then make sure that you go slow enough that you don't go beyond the diameter that you're looking for, because you can't put this back. And if you want it to be smooth all the way down, then you've got to work to the lowest point in your diameter and not go below that. Every little nick that you go below that, to keep it symmetrical, you'd have to go down that much more throughout the length of the stock. So be careful and don't go deeper than you want to go when you're turning this, and be careful on the ends as well. Now we've about got this turned down to about the size that I want it. Now your French style rolling pins are a little bit smaller in diameter than American style ones are. So if this one looks a little bit thin to you, it's that way by design. We're going to put a taper on the last 4 inches of each end to make a handle, as you'll see here in just a minute. And we'll talk about how we do that. And that's really where, in a rolling pin, the only place for your creativity, I guess, to really show, because you want the body of the rolling pin to be symmetrical. And what I'm going to do here is just measure in. I think I started with about 6 inches, but I changed my mind here and decided to go back to 4 because I wanted more of the body of the rolling pin to be the diameter that I've got it down to, and less handle. So I end up here, I think, with about 4 inches of handle on each end, where we'll start our taper. Now I'm just going to make a mark, just at first, just a tick mark with a pencil at 4 inches. Then we'll set our tool rest up, and I'll show you how to make that mark go all the way around. And this will be your reference for where you want to start the taper for your handle. Once we get this marked, we'll begin to gouge a little bit deeper and take this taper down to about the size of our live center on the end of our lathe chuck. Now I'm just marking the circumference of this stock now with this pencil dark enough so that we can see where to start and where to stop. Once we get those marks, I want to make sure we've got them the same on both ends. We want to keep symmetry here as best we can. Then we're going to turn it back on, make our mark just a little bit darker so we can see it. We don't knock it off of there with the first pass with a chisel. And then we're going to start to make this taper. And I think my most narrow roughing gouge is a 1/2 inch wide. I need to buy me one that's a little bit narrower than that so that I can do more detail work on these ends. The ends of this is really where your creativity can show. You can put any kind of design that you want to on the handle, because it's not going to be what's rolling out your dough. Here we're going to put a French taper on this one, but really the sky's the limit, and your imagination and your ability are the limits to what you can do with the ends of this as far as design goes. You could put cove and beads on this if you knew how, if you wanted to experiment with that. Just about any kind of design that you could come up with, as long as you have the right tools for it and the right patience and know-how. Now I'm still new at turning, and a lot of these details I make a bigger mess than you can clean up if I'm not careful. So what I'm going to do here is just work this down to a smooth taper, and we're going to call this one good. But once I get a couple of more narrow chisels, I'd like to start working on some detail stuff on some of the handles of these, also with some of the ink pens that we turn. Really, if you want your, take your turning to the next level, you've got to be pretty good with design and pretty good with executing the designs that you've got. I have a plan to turn some lamps pretty soon. I've seen some that have been done by a man that I know that they turned out just really awesome, and I'd I'd like to do some one of these days, and there's going to be some detail in that I'm just really not up to par with yet. This, you watch a video like this, and it looks fairly simple, and the mechanics of it are simple, but the detail and the intricate little ins and outs of this apparently take more experience than I've gotten yet. So right now, simple tapers and good symmetry is kind of where I'm at in my training process to make these look like anything at all. And we're going to try. I've never worked with pecan, as I said before. We're going to try to put a good finish on this. We'll talk about that when we get to it. But remember, with anything like a rolling pin or a bowl or something that you're going to use in the kitchen, you always want to make sure that you use a food grade finish. You don't want to put any kind of finish on this with a petroleum base or anything that might be toxic. Most of the pins that I turn, I finish with some really high gloss wax and varnish, but it's not food grade. You wouldn't want to eat it, so you don't want to use anything like that on something that's going to be used around anything that you might eat. Now we've got our taper on the far end there about like we want it. We're going to take this end here down and get it about the same. We're not going to spend a lot of time showing this on the video. Now we're going to go to the sanding process, and I'm sorry I get in the way here of what you can see, but I do. We're going to start with 120 grit sandpaper, and we're going to work our way all the way up to about 600 grit. We're going to get this thing as close to glass smooth as we possibly can, and then we're going to put a coconut oil finish on this and buff that out, and hopefully we'll have something that looks pretty good. I'm up to about 320 grit on the sandpaper here. You have to be careful with this sandpaper because this lathe spinning about 1500 RPMs. That sandpaper gets pretty hot to touch pretty quick. Now I'm just wiping on some denatured alcohol to remove all the dust particles out of the pores of the wood, and it'll also kind of give you a preview of what this is going to look like finished. See how it darkens that wood and also brings out quite a bit more of the grain. Now this denatured alcohol doesn't have any oil in it, so it evaporates real quick. But now we're going to wipe on a good coconut oil or a few coats of good coconut oil here, and then we're going to rub that in and buff it out, and we'll have a rolling pin with a food grade finish on it that can actually be used in the kitchen for whatever you want to do. If you want to roll out a pie crust or dumplings or whatever you want to do, if you want to roll out crust for a cobbler and all that. And we've got it sanded and we've got our coconut oil on there. Now I'm just taking a pretty lint-free paper towel. I've turned the lathe speed up to about 3,000, and we're just going to try to buff the sheen out of this a little bit. And there you've got a solid pecan French tapered rolling pin.